What happens when a Hollywood icon decides he's done playing by the new rules of television? No one expected to find out that night. Millions tuned in anticipating a cozy late-night chat, some charming throwbacks, and the usual polished nostalgia. Instead, what unfolded inside ABC's Hollywood studio was nothing short of an on-air detonation. Within minutes, a harmless interview began mutating into something far more volatile. The audience had shown up hungry for fun. They wanted to see Harrison Ford, the pilot of the Millennium Falcon, the fedora-wearing adventurer who cracked his whip through cinema history, the man whose character shaped entire generations. At 81, he was expected to sit back, grin, and maybe poke fun at the aches and pains of getting older. But Ford had arrived carrying something the crowd didn't expect. Something sharp, something real. Jimmy Kimmel, confident as ever behind his desk, believed he had the night under control. For years, he'd turned awkward moments into punchlines and heavy topics into soft, digestible jokes. He knew the rhythm of the stage better than anyone. But this time, he wasn't dealing with a celebrity eager to promote a project. He was sitting across from a man who built his legacy not by charming crowds, but by commanding them. And the moment Kimmel pushed too far, the night took a turn no one could have scripted. Ford wasn't there for sound bites. He wasn't there to smile for the cameras or play along with Hollywood's newest talking points. He came with something heavier, something personal, unfiltered, uncompromising. The silence that would soon drop across the studio wasn't comedic timing. It was the kind of stillness that comes before a storm. And when Harrison Ford finally rose from his chair and walked off set, the world didn't just see a guest ending an interview. They witnessed a collision. Old-school Hollywood steel-smashing headfirst into the polished politics of the modern entertainment machine. Raw authenticity clashing with carefully curated morality. One man refusing to play a role, and in doing so, rattling the entire foundation of late-night television. Yet the night had started like any other episode of Jimmy Kimmel Live. The audience buzzed beneath the stage lights, laughter blending with the brassy punch of the band. Producers behind the glass exchanged satisfied nods. Cameras glided into place. Every piece of the machine was humming exactly as it should. Then Harrison Ford stepped onto the stage. Even at 81, he carried a presence that demanded silence. The lines on his face weren't signs of age. They were reminders of every war he'd fought in Hollywood's trenches. He didn't need to plaster on a smile to own the room. His presence alone was enough. Kimmel launched into his trademark introduction, booming with enthusiasm. Ladies and gentlemen, the man, the myth, the legend, Harrison Ford. The studio erupted. It was classic Kimmel. Flashy energy, humor, and a dash of hero worship. Ford offered a subtle nod as he took his seat. No theatrics. No exaggerated charm. Just quiet control. The contrast was immediate. Kimmel buzzed with constant movement, while Ford sat still and unmoved, like a statue carved out of Hollywood's old guard. The interview began harmlessly enough. Kimmel asked about Ford's new film. Ford gave short, respectful answers. There were jokes about old injuries, stories about directors, and a comfortable rhythm. Exactly what the audience expected. But beneath that calm surface, tension was gathering, and soon the comfortable late-night routine would be shattered. The crowd kept laughing, Kimmel kept tossing out jokes, and Ford answered with that unmistakable gravel in his voice, the kind that carried decades of experience. Everything appeared warm, easy, predictable. Classic late-night TV. But underneath that comfortable surface, something wasn't lining up. There was a sharper edge in Ford's eyes, a flicker of something that didn't match the light banner. Whenever Kimmel cracked a joke, Ford didn't always return the smile. When the audience erupted in laughter, he didn't feed off it. He simply let the noise hit him and fall away, detached, observing, waiting. The audience didn't notice a shift. They were still wrapped in the safety blanket of routine entertainment. Kimmel didn't see it either, too confident in his ability to steer any conversation back to applause. But Harrison Ford, he knew this wasn't going to be one more pleasant round of nostalgia. He hadn't come to play the part the show expected of him. And then the rhythm changed. Kimmel, who had spent the entire night keeping things light and breezy, let his smile tighten. His tone shifted. He leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing, and dropped the question that would split the night in half. "You know, Harrison," he said casually, too casually, "you've been in this business more than 50 years. You've seen Hollywood evolve. What do you think about how the industry handles controversial figures now?" The sentence fell into the studio like a weight, breaking the atmosphere instantly. Ford didn't speak. Not right away. He sat perfectly still, jaw set, shoulders stiff, hands gripping the chair's arms just a little too tightly. Under the stage lights, his eyes darkened, hardened. "What exactly are you asking, Jimmy?" he said. Quiet, controlled, but forged out of steel. Kimmel leaned forward, sensing tension and opportunity. "Well, we've seen actors, directors, celebrities being held accountable for things they've said or done. Some people call it responsibility. Others call it cancel culture. You've always said what you think. Doesn't it ever worry you saying the wrong thing?" The question hung there far too long. The audience, mid-smile, froze. A few shifted uncomfortably, as if their bodies understood the stakes before their minds did. Ford's grip tightened. His gaze locked onto Kimmel's. And then, slowly, he answered. "I think people should be free to voice their opinions," he said. Every word carefully placed, without living in fear that one comment will end their entire career because of a mob mentality. The room fell silent. Not the playful silence of a setup. This was cold, heavy, suffocating. Kimmel's eyebrows lifted. His grin sharpened. He smelled a moment that could go viral. "That's interesting," he said. The charm still there, but wrapped around something colder. "So you're saying some of the people who face backlash didn't deserve it? We're not just talking about unpopular opinions. Some cases involve serious allegations. Loaded, intentional." A verbal grenade rolled across the desk. Ford leaned forward just a fraction, and the temperature of the studio dropped again. His voice sank even lower, carrying a quiet force that filled every inch of the room. "I'm talking about the principle, Jimmy," he said, steady but unyielding. "There's a difference between holding people responsible for real wrongdoing and destroying someone's entire livelihood because they made a mistake a decade ago, or because their views don't match whatever the acceptable narrative is today." The studio no longer felt like a crowd enjoying a comedy show. It had transformed into something colder, a courtroom, a battlefield. Every eye was glued to the two men locked in a verbal standoff. In that moment, the interview changed shape entirely. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was ignition, the first spark in a war of words that would grow hotter with every exchange. The polite laughter was gone. The facade of late-night charm had cracked wide open. The real clash had begun. A suffocating silence settled over the studio, thick like smoke after a blast. Jimmy Kimmel's trademark smile faltered, no longer playful, now strained and uneasy. He seemed to realize Ford wasn't going to hand him the clean, viral moment he'd been fishing for. Yet Kimmel pushed forward, leaning into his desk as if anchoring himself. "But Harrison," he said, firmer now, "don't you think actors and public figures, people with influence, should be careful about what they say, especially on sensitive topics?" Ford's eyes narrowed, and when he spoke, his voice carried a steel edge that cut straight through the quiet. "Careful according to who?" he asked. The gravel in his tone sliced through the room. "You? A wave of angry strangers on Twitter? Some boardroom full of executives? Or maybe an algorithm written by a handful of 20-somethings in Silicon Valley?" The line hit like a fist. The audience, laughing moments earlier, went dead still. A few shifted in their seats, like they'd accidentally stepped into a conversation that was never meant for them. Behind the cameras, producers exchanged panicked glances. Someone whispered about cutting the commercial, but the red light above the cameras stayed bright. The show was live, and every second of this was being broadcast. Kimmel's smile thinned further, sharpening into something harder. "I wouldn't call it a Twitter mob," he said. "I'd call it accountability. When people with massive platforms spread harmful ideas, there have to be consequences." Ford leaned in, his shadow stretching across the desk. "And who decides what's harmful, Jimmy?" he asked. "Who gets to sit in judgment? You? Network executives? Or talk show hosts who pretend they're the moral compass of the entire country?" The words cracked through the studio like thunder. For a split second, Kimmel's polished composure flickered. His voice tightened as he forced it steady. I think most reasonable people can recognize hate speech when they hear it. Harrison, we're not debating philosophy. We're talking about basic human decency. Ford let out a low, humorless laugh. Quiet, but sharp enough to make the hairs on necks rise. Basic human decency. Convenient phrase, he said. Broad enough to mean whatever you want to mean. Useful enough to shut down any argument you don't like. The tension was now solid. Heavy enough to feel. The air vibrated with it. Camera operators instinctively zoomed in, sensing they were capturing something extraordinary. The entire atmosphere felt charged, like the room was a powder keg waiting for a spark. Kimmel's jaw tightened. His voice rose. The entertainer's mask slipped. Look, we can agree racism, sexism, bigotry, those things are wrong. When public figures promote that, they should face consequences. That's not controversial. That's common sense. Ford cut him off instantly, sharp, unwavering. There you go again, framing the debate in a way that always works in your favor. The words sliced right through the air. Kimmel's face flushed. His usual rhythm, setup, joke, applause, was gone. This wasn't an interview anymore. It was combat. I'm not defining anything, Kimmel fired back. I'm saying harmful behavior deserves pushback. That's how society works. Ford straightened, his expression hardening. When he spoke, his gravelly voice rang across the studio with icy precision. Society? Or just your version of it? Because where I come from, society isn't defined by groupthink in a Malibu mansion. It isn't whatever a studio board decides is acceptable this week. A soft gasp rolled through the audience. They weren't watching a talk show. They were watching two worlds collide. Kimmel's hands tightened around his desk. His eyes locked on Ford's. His voice rose visibly. That's rich. Coming from someone who's made millions playing heroes who solve everything with violence. Maybe you're just uncomfortable with the idea that the real world requires more nuance than your movies. Ford's eyes flashed, dangerously, unmistakably. Ford's voice dropped to a chilling stillness. Quiet control, but lethal. Don't talk to me about nuance, Jimmy. And don't pretend this, he gestured subtly around the studio, is anything more than a performance. You take complicated issues and shrink them into punchlines. You turn disagreement into division. You make your audience feel superior to people they'll never meet. Every word struck like a hammer. Kimmel leaned in, and for the first time, his voice trembled under the weight of the moment. I am trying to have real conversations, he insisted. Honest ones. Maybe that makes you uncomfortable? Harrison, maybe you've spent so long hiding behind characters that you don't know how to face the truth anymore. Ford lifted himself an inch in his seat, the movement small but powerful. His shadow stretched across the desk. Hiding behind characters? He echoed, his voice laced with fury. At least when I play a character, I'm honest about it. I don't sit behind a desk pretending I'm the moral compass of the entire country. The audience was still as statues. No laughter, no clapping, just a soft mechanical hum of studio equipment, and the unmistakable sense that something historic was unfolding right in front of them. Two men, two belief systems, two eras of Hollywood colliding like tectonic plates, and the pressure in the room was still rising. The tension had grown past uncomfortable. It was suffocating. The studio felt smaller, tighter, as if the air itself had thickened. And then it happened. Harrison Ford stood up, slowly, intentionally. His 6-foot frame rose like a storm front building on the horizon. Shadows stretched across the stage. His eyes, fierce, iconic, unmistakably him, burned with the same intensity that once froze audiences as Han Solo stared down his enemies, or when Indiana Jones marched into danger with nothing but grit. For a moment, the entire world seemed to inhale. Kimmel stood too, unwilling to be visually overshadowed. He tugged at his jacket, forcing confidence into a voice that trembled at the edges. You know what, Harrison? He snapped. You're just another privileged Hollywood elite defending bigotry, because it doesn't affect you. You're everything that's wrong with old Hollywood. The accusation cracked through the studio like a gavel hitting wood. Ford didn't flinch. His lips twisted into something between a smirk and a warning. When he spoke, his voice was so soft the microphones had to chase the words. But the impact hit like thunder. "Old Hollywood," he repeated, tasting the term like it was toxic. "Let me tell you about old Hollywood, Jimmy. We made art, not propaganda. We told stories, not sermons. We respected our audiences. We didn't lecture them. We trusted them to think for themselves. The room was mesmerized. You could feel the stillness. Even the camera operators, professionals trained to stay invisible, had their hands trembling as they captured what might become one of the most replayed confrontations in television history. Kimmel's face flushed deep red. His knuckles whitened around the edge of his desk. "Art? Respect?" he spat. "Come on, Harrison. You spent your career cashing in on fantasy, pretending to be a hero while the real world moved on. You're a rich actor who made his fortune playing pretend." The insult landed hard. But Ford's reaction was colder, a chilling, surgical calm. He stepped closer, leaning forward, cutting the distance between them until his presence dominated the space. When he spoke, the words slid out like a blade. "When this ends, Jimmy," Ford said, locking onto him with a predator stare, "I'll go home and sleep just fine. Because I know I live my life with integrity. Can you say the same?" The sentence hit, like a physical strike. Kimmel tried to respond, but his mouth opened with no word behind it. His years of polished calm, his TV armor, his entertainer's mask, they cracked all at once, right there under the hot studio lights. His gaze flicked wildly across the studio, over the crowd, the cameras, the blinding lights, searching for some kind of exit, but there was none. The tension held him in place like iron shackles. And then Ford stepped forward. "I've spent half a century earning the trust of audiences," he began, his voice no longer soft but rising with purpose. Every line landed like a hammer on steel. "I've put my life on the line, shattered bones, given everything I had to give people something real, something honest." The room leaned in, sensing the storm wasn't over. He fixed a stare on Jimmy. "And what do, Jimmy? You sit behind a desk and pass judgment. You turn complicated human issues into late-night punchlines. You tear people down so your viewers can feel superior for 10 seconds before the next commercial break." Every word hit harder than the last. Kimmel's smile faded, the confidence draining from his face. He opened his mouth to respond, but Ford sliced through the moment like a blade. "You call it accountability," Ford growled, "but what you really do is destroy. Destroy reputations. Destroy careers. Destroy conversations that matter, because destruction gets ratings." The studio froze. Eyes bounced between the two men, like spectators watching the final rally of a championship match. But this wasn't a match. This was a duel. Kimmel tried once more to find footing, desperation sharpening his tone. "I use my platform to fight for what's right, to call out hatred. I give a voice to the voiceless. That's more than hiding behind movie roles and staying quiet when it counts." Ford let out a cold, humorless laugh. He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "Quiet? Don't you lecture me about silence. I fought my battles in the real world long before you ever sat down behind this desk. I've seen real consequences, real oppression, and I didn't need applause or an audience to do it." Kimmel's face reddened to a dangerous shade, the strain visible in every twitch. "So, because you're older, because you've played heroes, that makes you an authority on moral courage? You're clinging to a past that doesn't even exist anymore." For a heartbeat, everything went still. Then Ford leaned across the desk, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt louder than shouting. "You want to know the difference between us, Jimmy?" His eyes burned with controlled fury. "I don't need to destroy people to feel important. I don't need to turn anyone who disagrees with me into a villain just to win an argument. Real strength isn't tearing people down. It's lifting them up, and that's something you'll never understand." Kimmel froze, his lips parted but no words coming out. The confident host was gone. In his place stood a man exposed beneath the unforgiving studio lights. Ford straightened his jacket with slow, deliberate movements, reclaiming the room in silence. Then he turned to the audience, his voice echoing with unshakable authority. "You came here for entertainment," he said. "Not for a lecture. Not for another sermon about how broken the world is. And the blame for that confusion rests with people who mistake fame for wisdom." The silence was suffocating. This wasn't a show anymore. It wasn't rehearsed, polished, or planned. It was raw, unfiltered, unforgettable. The audience sat paralyzed. No applause, no nervous laughter, not even a whisper. Just a heavy thrum of something monumental settling into the room. Harrison Ford stood tall, the last sparks of storm still flickering in his eyes. Then he inhaled deeply, steadied himself, and let his voice soften just enough to carry across the room with dignity. "Ladies and gentlemen, you came here tonight to be entertained, not to sit through lectures, not to be dragged into someone else's crusade. And the blame for that falls on those who mistake fame for wisdom." His words rolled through the room like distant thunder. A wave of unease rippled through the audience. No one clapped. No one chuckled. They simply stared, held in place by the rare, electrifying honesty hanging in the air. Ford turned toward the wings, his footsteps echoing across the silent studio floor. Every step felt like a closing door, a man done with performance, done with the politics, done with the noise. It was the sound of finality. And then, behind him, something broke. "Harrison, wait, wait." Jimmy Kimmel's voice cracked, stripped of its usual swagger. Desperation clung to every syllable. "We can work this out." Ford stopped at the very edge of the stage. Slowly, very slowly, he looked back over his shoulder. The fury from earlier was gone. In its place was something far heavier. Disappointment. A kind that cuts deeper than anger ever could. "No, Jimmy," he said softly, but the quiet only made it sharper. "Because working it out requires listening. And somewhere along the way, you forgot how." The words didn't just land. They detonated. The studio froze. No movement, no breath, no camera hum. Just a suspended moment, as if time itself refused to step forward. Then Ford turned and disappeared into the wings, leaving behind only the hollow echo of his departure. Kimmel stood rooted behind his desk, his face drained to paper white. His mouth opened, then closed, and opened again, but nothing came out. His persona, the one built over years of late-night dominance, had cracked wide open, in front of millions. He looked like a man blindsided by a freight train. The silence refused to lift. It thickened, heavy, suffocating, impossible to escape. For the first time in his career, Jimmy Kimmel had no joke, no spin, no comeback. And Harrison Ford was gone. For several long seconds after his exit, the entire studio remained locked in stunned paralysis. Then, like a spark catching dry brush, whispers began. Soft at first, nervous, then louder, spreading row by row as people tried to understand what they had just witnessed. Some audience members, hands trembling, slid their phones out beneath jackets, risking everything to capture the aftermath despite the no-recording policy. Security rushed in, confiscating devices where they could, but it didn't matter. The moment had already slipped into the world. Hours later, blurry clips surfaced online, then clearer ones. Within minutes, they spread like wildfire, retweeted, reposted, remixed, dissected. Hashtags exploded across every platform. Comment sections became battlegrounds. Half the internet hailed Ford as a legend speaking truths no one else dared to touch. The other half claimed it was a meltdown, a generational clash, a man out of time. But everyone was watching. By sunrise, major outlets replayed the encounter on loop, analyzing every narrowed eye, every pause, every razor-edge line. It had evolved from on-air tension to a cultural earthquake. Days later, the fallout became impossible to ignore. Kimmel's ratings nosedived. Viewers tuned out, calling him bitter, condescending, and blinded by self-righteousness. His once untouchable grip on late night suddenly looked shaky, maybe even broken. Ford, meanwhile, emerged untouched. More than untouched, elevated. That night didn't tarnish his legacy. It burnished it. At 81, he wasn't just a Hollywood icon. He became something rarer. A man unafraid to stand against the tide, unmoved by outraged culture, unwilling to play along. He had nothing left to prove. And yet, somehow, he proved everything. For Jimmy Kimmel. It became a public reckoning. A brutal reminder that holding the microphone isn't the same as earning respect. For Harrison Ford, it became a defining moment. A masterclass in integrity, presence, and unfiltered truth. They came for entertainment. What they got was television history.